Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Bill Maley, Brighton Town Supervisor. I'm so pleased to have all of you here this evening for what I think is going to be a very interesting and informative panel discussion as part of the town's Black History Month celebration. I do want to first introduce several elected officials who are here from our town board. Councilmember Robin Wilt, Councilmember Christine Corrado, and Councilmember Jason DePonzio are all with us tonight. Thank you all for coming. I would also note Mark Kokanovich from the town's IDEA board, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, as well as town historian Mary Jo Lanphier. It's great to have you here, and assistant to the supervisor Bridget Monroe. Before we begin tonight's panel discussion, and I am really grateful for this power panel that we have with us tonight. But I do want to first acknowledge and ask that we all acknowledge that the town of Brighton is situated on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Onondaga tribe of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whom we recognize and respect as the traditional custodians of this land throughout the generations. We pay our respect to the Onondaga elders, both past and present. Just as we gather here tonight to listen and learn from Black history, the history, the culture, and the traditions of the Onondaga are also worthy and important for us to understand and to study. We praise those who keep their traditions alive. We recognize that that study is of ongoing importance if we are truly to understand the history of our community and our nation. And we support efforts to ensure that we and future generations continue that study and that respect in a way that is honest and truthful, so that, in the words of Sacagawea, the great chief and orator, also known as Red Jacket, we may always continue to work together to brighten the chain of friendship. Again, we're proud to hold this panel discussion as part of Brighton's celebration of February as Black History Month. Between the town and Brighton Memorial Library, we're holding a number of activities celebrating Black History Month, and tonight's panel discussion is an important part of that celebration. This year we started the celebration of Black History Month in Brighton with a glorious book sandwiched in event held by Brighton Memorial Library featuring Thomas Warfield, Director of Dance at RIT and NTID, reviewing and sharing his thoughts as a Black artist on the book entitled The Violin Conspiracy. We'll conclude this month's celebration with a similar event featuring Brighton's Chief Diversity Officer, Miriam Moore, and I'll be introducing Miriam more formally in just a moment, but she'll be speaking about the book 400 Souls at the Brighton Memorial Library at noon on February 28th, and I hope all of you will be able to attend that. One of the reasons we're here tonight is that we acknowledge that Black history is American history. Now, to my mind, that simple but powerful notion underlies all that we do during Black History Month. We also can recognize, we should recognize, that history is being made around us every day in ways large and small by people who change the shape of our world, our nation, or our community by their concerted actions. Tonight, we're going to be privileged to hear three of Rochester's contemporary Black history makers in a panel discussion that will be moderated by another history maker, our Chief Diversity Officer, Miriam Moore. The town board made the unanimous decision to hire Miriam as Brighton's first Chief Diversity Officer almost a year ago. That grew out of the work of the IDEA board that Councilmember Wilt has been the town board liaison for and really generated the concept of that idea. Since joining as Chief Diversity Officer, Miriam has worked with town staff to ensure that DEI is a core element of our operations. She's worked with the IDEA Board to begin the implementation of our IDEA plan, and that plan will serve as a roadmap for us and for future generations here in Brighton for our DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion activities. Miriam has reached out to community members and leaders to listen to their thoughts and to share her vision for Brighton's continued standing as a diverse and engaged community, something that we're all proud of. It gives me great pleasure then to introduce tonight's panel moderator, Brighton's Chief Diversity Officer, Miriam Moore. Miriam.
Thank you, Supervisor Maley. You know, we are incredibly excited to welcome tonight's three panelists as they lend their perspectives as the town of Brighton honors Black History Month, celebrating the past, upholding the present, and promoting perpetuity. Each have a history of being amazingly impactful, drivers of change, and unapologetically Black. I have the honor of moderating tonight's panel discussion, but would first like to share a bit about tonight's guest, Mr. James Blunt. In 1972, Mr. James Blunt and his wife Carolyn became the sole proprietors of About Time magazine, one of the oldest African American publications in the country. Blunt left IBM in 1973 and became the president and publisher of About Time magazine the following year. Under Blunt's leadership, About Time magazine published interviews with such figures as Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, National Security Advisor Colin Powell, the Army, Clifford Alexander, Secretary of the Army, Clifford Alexander, civil rights leaders Leon Sylvian and Dorothy I. Height. About Time published a 6-part history series called Rochester Roots/Routes. Other notable pieces published under Blunt's tenure include The Last Mile of a 400-Year Journey, Katrina Echoes, Storm Season Aftermath is Hard to Erase, and Strange Fruit, Jenna 6 and the Quest for American Justice. Please help me welcome Mr. James Blunt. Lawana Jones, Chief Operating Officer for United Way of Greater Rochester and the Finger Lakes. As a seasoned executive and visionary leader, Lawana was appointed in 2022 as the new Chief Operating Officer of United Way of Greater Rochester and the Finger Lakes. United Way represents one of the largest funders of the nonprofit sector in Rochester and the surrounding 6-county region, with the agency recently announcing $35.8 raised for the community in 2022. Lawana was born and raised in Rochester and graduated from Pittsford Minden High School as part of the Urban-Suburban Transfer Program. Lawana has a bachelor's degree from Nazareth College and MBA certificate from the University of Rochester. Lawana also has 16 years of nonprofit leadership as the founder and executive director of the Autism Council of Rochester. Disability rights is a cause near and dear to her heart, and she has a daughter with autism. She has decided and dedicated her life to advocating, supporting, and educating others on disability rights. Lawana was honored for her community efforts in 2020 and was awarded the New York State Woman of Distinction for the 56th Senate District by Senator Joseph E. Robach. Lawana is a 26-year Gates resident and the mother of 2 daughters, Marche and Tori. Please help me welcome Lawana Jones. And last but certainly not least, Adrian Hale. Before entering the crypto industry, Adrian Hell worked to improve educational outcomes for the community's youth and enhance the quality of Rochester regional workforce. He was the youngest Greater Rochester Chamber executive in the organization's history, creating its Talent, Workforce Development, and Education Initiatives Office. Hell was also nominated for and awarded various leadership and community-focused awards throughout his professional career, including the Center for Teen Empowerment Award, Champion for Youth Leadership Award, 2 Rock Black Men Archive Awards, and the 40 Under 40 recognition by the Rochester Business Journal. After graduating from the Rochester City School District, Hell went on to become a graduate of Yale University. Please help me welcome Adrian Hell. Mr. Blunt, the first question is for you. A 2020 article titled Milestones of the Black Press in the U.S. Show Its Enduring Importance by Neiman notes the Black press has powered political action and lifted spirits as it chronicled achievements, aspirations, and challenges. The article goes on to say the first U.S. Black-owned and operated publication, Freedom's Journal, was established in 1827. The publishers, John B. Russman and Samuel Cornish, stated, "We want to plead our case. Too long have others spoken for us." As the publisher of one of the most historic and long-standing Black-owned publications in this nation, how has this notion played out into your commitment to publishing the stories and raising the voices of Blacks?
Thank you. It's been a very interesting ride these last 50 years. We started in 1972, our first issue, and some people were telling us there are not enough stories in the Black community. Well, we soon put that to rest. In fact, there are too many. We can't even publish them all. But on a more serious note, 1984, when the city of Rochester was celebrating its 150th birthday, the sesquicentennial, the mayor came to us because he was trying to get all the different ethnic groups, the quilt that make up, the racial quilt that make up the city of Rochester, community of Monroe, as the former county executive Lou Morin would like to say, and make it inclusive. And we started to put together a series of articles called Rochester Roots Routes. And I mean, you know, July and August and September, and it was amazing. It even went to January, February the following year. It was just unbelievable. We had a young lady who came to our office. That's before Eastman became a chemical-based film processing mechanism. She had a plate. It says Eastman Dry Plate Company. I said, "Do you know what that is? Go put it in your safe deposit box and keep it." But it was a perfect image. I mean, no grain, spotless, unreal. So this science of photographic imaging has been a godsend for humanity. And let me give you another example of that. I'm a saltwater sailor. My dad was a waterman, so I knew something about the laws of the sea. Ebb tide, flood tide, slack water. So I'm in the Mediterranean. We had a draft in this country at one time. Everybody had to do their thing, had to sign up. So I preferred the Navy. I knew something about boats and ships. So we're in the Mediterranean Sea in 1968, I think it was, the North Atlantic Alliance, what Zbigniew Brzezinski would call NATO today, was celebrating its 25th anniversary, and I'll never forget. We were with part of a task force, a big United States Navy aircraft carrier, and they had to symbol the mathematical equations from Einstein, E equals mc squared. I got to take a picture of this. So I go down to the store, the little commissary, get me an Instamatic camera. Well, where am I going to process all of this information and keep it? And Mr. Eastman, George Eastman, had figured that out. Remember? He said, you press the button, we do the rest. I bought a pouch. FPO is Fleet Post Office, APO is Army Post Office. A helicopter came to my ship, picked up the mail, came back to Rochester on Ridge Road, processed the film. I had slides and prints, and they're just as good today as they were over 50 years ago, almost 60 years ago. So this science of photographic imaging, which is a basis for Rochester, is wonderful. But that's all part of the press. That's part of this imaging. When Frederick Douglass was here, you got to remember, he started the newspaper. The North Star was here because the black press can do things that the most major media, even though it's changed, they're doing a much better job. They're becoming some real competition, but that's good for the community at large. Mm-hmm. There's a historical black newspaper out of Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Courier. Been around a long time. In fact, that's how Branch Rickey found out who some of the best black baseball players were, so he could integrate the Brooklyn Dodgers. And by the way, Jackie Robinson, at one time when we had the International League, it was truly an international league. The Rochester Red Wings was part of that. They had a team in Montreal, Canada, Toronto, Canada, Continental United States, obviously, and Havana, Cuba. So it was really an international league. Well, on one of Jackie's trips here, because he played for Montreal, they played Rochester, a group of black men gave him a reception at the Elks Hall, and the gentleman had written the name of each person who was there. He said, well, I'm sorry I wrote over it. I said, don't worry about that. This is an official document. So we ran that, and some people saw it. They wanted to know, where did I get the picture from? So this thing about the press is a powerful institution. It's just like one of the politicians said, if you want to find out what's really going on, just put a little sunshine on it. Open it up to the press, and that's the best disinfectant in the world. But it's just been amazing what the black press has been able to do. I had one of my writers doing the Million Man March. I was trying to find out what is this all about. This guy got into the capital of the Rotunda of the United States when there was over 1 million people on that mall, from the Capitol steps across 14th Street to the George Washington Monument, which is unreal. I mean, what a mass of humanity. I mean, they were out on the wings, Pennsylvania Avenue, Constitution Avenue. So, I mean, it was, and Bill Clinton was the president of the United States at the time. He had to leave. He was having his own challenges. So the press is a powerful institution, and that's why we need a press, a free press that's unencumbered from government influence, because that sort of keeps everybody honest. In fact, when Lyndon Johnson was having problems with the war in Vietnam, the late news reporter, in fact, he named a school after him, his name escapes me. Out in Arizona State University, he went over to Vietnam to see for himself what the status of that war was, and he simply said, it's hopeless. And Lyndon Johnson replied, well, if Walter Cronkite says it's no hope, I'm done. We got to wind this thing down. So here we are. That's why the press is so important.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. Luana, in the book, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment by Patricia Hill Collins, she posits the idea that for change to be continuous, it cannot be exclusively focused on one social group, further noting that a social movement that is only concentrated and concerned with racial inequities may end its influence once equity for that group is achieved. It is vital to understand her intent is to place U.S. Black women's experiences in the center of analysis without privileging those experiences. The basis for the author's stance is the notion that we can learn significantly from Black women's knowledge. As a Black woman who has undoubtedly been a driver in both the nonprofit and for-profit realm, how has this knowledge that Patricia Hill Collins speaks of in a way that is unique to Black women influenced your leadership?
Thank you. First of all, let me just say, my experience as a Black woman and the success that I've had has really been influenced primarily by my own developmental process, really around my ability to navigate not just the educational environment, so having gone to school out in Pittsburgh, and then also finding allies, even in corporate America, when I work in corporate America. It really has helped me with my sense of being and belonging, and it was important for me also to have not only allies, but mentors in that space. But it was challenging, to be honest with you, to really find myself and find my place in corporate. I would say that in the nonprofit space, it has been very much different. There's been a lot of progress made locally, nationally around nonprofits and having people of color in that leadership role, but there are still challenges in corporate America. So it is important to find mentors and find folks that will give you an opportunity to lead. Some will say, well, that you don't have enough experience. Well, how do you get experience if you aren't given a chance, right, to actually be able to lead? So to say the least, like I said, in corporate America, it's been challenging. And nonprofit, though, taking on the COO role at the United Way, I'm very proud of the work that we do and how it impacts our community. And that Jamie Saunders would take a chance to allow me to be in that space and be my unique self. I come to work being unique in who I am every single day. And growing up in Rochester, I know a lot about the challenges of our neighborhoods, because obviously I grew up in 14605, which is probably the most, Mike could probably tell me if this is true. 14605 right now, I believe, is the poorest zip code in Monroe County. So that's where I came from. And my dad also always raised us, there were 3 daughters, to believe in ourselves and know that given a chance, you've got to excel. And it's expected that we are to excel, even in the nonprofit and corporate space. When we get in, we have to do our best. Mm-hmm. And so I agree wholeheartedly with the author.
Thank you, Lawana. Adrienne. The often adversarial relationship between Black undergraduates and PWIs, predominantly white institutions, has been well documented. A 2015 article authored by Sean Harper of the University of Pennsylvania shares examples based on a study. Such include professors perceiving them to be inferior with efforts, which of course must be matched by Black students having to prove their intellectual aptitude, enduring tokenism, and constant pressure to dispel strategies about the Black culture. As a graduate of Yale, a PWI, please share your thoughts on the experiences which would be taxing to any student pursuing an advanced education, but particularly Black students who experience otherism within just about every realm of the broader society.
Mm-hmm. Very, very important and powerful question, and I'll do my best to do justice with an answer. Before I do, though, I just want to acknowledge all of you and town member Wilt, because without you all, I could not be here today. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm standing on you all's shoulders and the work that y'all do every day. So thank you. So like you, I'm from the 14621 zip code in Rochester, and I grew up in circumstances and situations that we see on the news every day, right? So I had a parent that was incarcerated. I had a mom that worked way too many jobs. I had a brother who was taken out of our home through foster care. I had a sister that got involved in some street activity that left a beautiful baby girl behind for me to step up and to have to raise at 12 years old to help my mom. And I would say it was in the midst of all of that struggling that I found my own purpose, because Adrian Hale didn't get to Yale because he wanted to get a degree and go make a whole lot of money. Adrian Hale went to Yale because in the midst of that struggling and suffering, I resolved that I wanted to be somebody one day who can do something about that. So I discovered purpose at a very young age. In addition to that, a lot of young people who grew up in circumstances like you, like me, were constantly being given narratives and messages about who we are and who we can be and who we can't be. And for a lot of us, and this is a part or an aspect of racism that we don't discuss, we internalize and inhale the fumes and sometimes the direct content of this idea of who we're supposed to be that is not created by us. And for a lot of black students, especially at institutions like Yale or Princeton or Harvard, and I've got to know a lot of other like black graduates from the Ivy League. So I'll speak from that perspective, because you get a certain type of person that aspires to that level of education. To achieve that kind of success and not have rooting and grounding in an identity and a purpose will lend you to becoming what society says you're supposed to be, which oftentimes is at conflict with who you need to be, who our community needs us to be, which is why now it's not enough to escape suffering and struggle if you don't understand that you have an obligation and responsibility to folks who had a similar shared lived experience as you. That if the objective is only to get out and abandon that situation, that, just to be clear, if we're familiar with, Mr. Blunt talked about, Lyndon Johnson, I'm gonna invoke the Kerner Report from 1964, where even then the nation had a strong understanding on two Americas and who was responsible for the America that black people had to live in. And now we all have a responsibility and obligation to dismantle from a structural perspective, which in my mind is the outcomes and our collective tolerance of adverse outcomes for black people in our community and in our country. From a systemic perspective, that the way they operate adversely affect and put black people at a disadvantage, even in social competition. So when we think about admission rates, grades, awards, I remember even when I was at Yale, above fraternities and sororities, there are very prestigious societies. And it was a big debate about why students of color were just as involved, just as engaged, showed themselves to be leaders, but could not get access into these societies. They could be admitted into fraternities and sororities, but not societies, right? Like, systemically, right? Like, we have to reprogram and reconfigure the way these systems operate to produce equitable outcomes. And then on a personal level, we have to commit to wanting to do the work. We have to acknowledge that we're all products. We've all internalized ideas and beliefs about people, and they show up in the way we treat one another. And so I think the most important thing for black people to understand is success means nothing if it doesn't uplift folks who share your lived experience and identity. And we have to stop thinking that the Adrian Hales of the world, and there's a number of other people, right, who all find themselves to be exceptions, are the rule, because in that moment we are tolerating exceptionalism and accepting that for the majority of people who look like us, who grow up like us, they have a very different life, very different reality. Individual effort is not the cure to a disease that puts populations at a disadvantage. So, I'm very blessed, and you all know that I've spent a long time since I've come back from school to try to enrich the community and enhance equity and ensure that Rochester works better for all of us and that we can build a community that we're all proud of, that we can all be proud of. So.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. Mr. Blunt, during a 2021 media panel discussion, moderator Karen, a Knight Foundation journalism director, raised a question. Are Black journalists biased? Because there is that assumption. Tucker, a panelist whose response was described as emphatic, swiftly answered, no. Further espousing, this question is not asked of white journalists. We have to bring our experiences to the story. That's what makes us unique. We too are professionals and including the know-how to look at things from every angle. Mr. Blunt, many scholars argue the lived experiences of Blacks afford them a knowledge that simply cannot otherwise be found. How do you allow that knowledge to work for you in the publishing industry?
We simply write about our experiences like any other good journalist would do. Let me back up and give you a point. There was a historical Black journalist. He worked for the State Department. Carl Royland was his name, if I'm not mistaken. And he had a talk show with some of the great journalists out of Washington, D.C. And he was a Navy guy. In fact, he came here and gave a talk at Nazareth College. And this was back in the late 40s, the 50s, when we didn't have that many Black journalists, period, on a national scale. So journalism has always been that beacon of hope. That's what Frederick Douglass wrote about in the North Star. If you really study his history and you really understand that here's a man that had no formal education, he learned how to read and write, and the reason he was in Rochester, because there was another outstanding African-American citizen here, Thomas James, the Reverend Thomas James. Neither could he learn how to read and write, but he left a plantation near Canajoharie, New York. Most of you have been to Albany, across the Mohawk River. He crossed the Mohawk River, the Genesee River, the Niagara River, went to St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, to build that Whalen Canal, which connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, learned how to read and write, came back to Rochester, founded Memorial AME Zion Church, and AME Zion Church in Syracuse, New York, and one in Ithaca, New York. And that was one reason why Frederick Douglass came, because we had a very strong abolitionist movement in this town. And it was based on reading and writing. And if you really, if you have been to Washington, D.C., Route 50, which is basically, it starts in downtown Washington. That's New York Avenue. Goes across the north side of Annapolis, Maryland, across Chesapeake Bay, St. Michael's, Cambridge, all that marshland. And you ask yourself, how was he able, in addition to Frederick Douglass, there was Harriet Tubman, you would like that. How did they navigate the Allegheny Mountain Range? I haven't figured that out yet, but I think they came up the Hudson River to Albany, didn't come across. Because that Allegheny Mountain Range runs from Lake Erie, Pennsylvania to the state of New Jersey. That's a lot of mountains. So what I'm saying is you have to write what you experience. And that's why in 1848, when Frederick Douglass and Susan B. gave a talk in Canandaigua on why should I celebrate the 4th of July. Obviously, Susan B. was advocating for women's suffrage, the right to vote, the right to go to college, the right to work, equal pay, equal, same fight, same thing that you heard today. Douglas was saying, how can we celebrate the 4th of July and we're in physical bondage, leg irons, neck irons, handcuffs? And then Douglas in 1852 probably gave his best speech that I've ever written. Right here in Rochester, New York, on the 4th of July, on the banks of the Genesee River where that hotel is, I think it's Holiday Inn. Oh my God. In fact, there's a replica of his speech at Rochester Museum and Science Center up on the 4th floor. You ought to check it out. To the slave, what is the 4th of July? In fact, he predicted the Civil War 8 years before it occurred. And he told the political elite, the political establishment, you but a freedom black slaves is going to be big time trouble. And all you have to do is go down Mount Hope Boulevard, that's Route 15, go right through Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and you see all those historical markers there where Robert E. Lee got it handed to him. Now, let me make another statement also, because at the end of that wall, there was a Native American, Park was his last name, who grew up on the Tonawanda Reservation outside of Buffalo, New York, went to the Catholic schools, learned how to read and write, got an appointment to the United States Military Academy, West Point, and at the time that the Civil War was ending, Lee had to sign the Instrument of Surrender document, and one of the generals was sick. So Parks was asked to create the document for Lee to sign, and at the time, it's alleged that Robert E. Lee saw this man of color. He had a hissy fit. and Ulysses Grant, being Ulysses Grant, said, well, we'll take care of this. But he signed the document on the banks of the Appomattox River. So America has had this duality, this hypocritical approach to things. And the real irony is Robert E. Lee went to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He had to sign a document to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. He made war on the Constitution. Now, if that was in old Europe, Germany, France, England, Spain, he would have been found guilty of sedition, trying to overthrow the United States government and execute it. That's the end of it. But the South made him a hero, and now they're coming to grips with that. There was a military base in Petersburg, Virginia, because that was the site that really determined who was going to win the Civil War. It was a crater there, thanks to them coal miners from Pennsylvania. And whoever won the Battle of Petersburg was going to win the war because it was nothing to defend the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And you can see a divide to this day. Well, it's changed a little bit. On one side on the east side of Broad Street was where all my European brothers and sisters went. On the west side was where all our people that looked like me went. It was fascinating. Okay, I don't want to get carried away, but journalism is the key. That's what keeps democracies flourishing, because you can, and Lyndon Johnson, he mentioned that. Lyndon said, we're politicians, we kiss babies and tell lies. That's true. Read his stuff, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. Luana, the next question is for you. There is a historical premise that leadership is unidirectional. In a 2022 book penned by scholar Carol Boyce Davies titled Black Women's Rights, Leadership, and the Circularities of Power, Davies defines Black women as transformative leaders, further arguing the ideas of circularities of power. How does the guiding principle of this book and the notion of circularities of power inform your strategies to execute in civic and professional spaces?
Interesting question. I found that there's a level of expectation that women, in order to be heard in spaces like corporate America and nonprofit, that you have to have some level of masculinity, and you have to be aggressive, and you have to be overly and overt in your behavior in order to be taken seriously in the space. But I've found that a person of color, a Black woman, and I'll reference my mentor was Ursula Burns when I was at Xerox. Very powerful woman. Ursula wore a short haircut. She was from New York. She had a New York accent. Her behavior was aggressive, and people took Ursula serious because she came in the space and she showed up as her authentic self no matter what. And so I had a chance to watch her and learn from her and how she operated in the space. I didn't take on those characteristics. I didn't cut my hair down. But I did make sure that when I showed up and shared my knowledge and my experience and being a leader in that space, that I was well versed. I had done my research, not necessarily that I showed up being masculine and overly aggressive, but I knew my stuff when I showed up. And that historically for me has been required as a Black female, that you have to come and be exceptional in order to be taken serious. And it was always expected. I don't think that's gonna change. I haven't seen that in my lifetime. And so I would agree, Black women and their leadership styles have been transformative, especially if you're able to come into a space and be authentic and not just have the status quo. I also pride myself on being a change agent whenever I show up in a space. I don't just go along with the flow, and I'll use the United Way for example. When I came into that job probably a year ago, we were experiencing, just coming off of COVID when I joined the team, and so we had a lot of folks that left. We were down, as most employers were in this country, losing people every single day. And I was given an opportunity to come in and say, this is how I think we need to turn this around. May not have been well received at the beginning, but I can tell you right now, I am able to show up and speak and be taken seriously in that space, and I didn't have to be overly masculine or aggressive. Having been raised in this town, I think I know a little bit about how nonprofits operate and about the needs of our community. And so we are transformative. I would say Black women are magical, right? We've heard that. I would agree wholeheartedly that we are.
Thank you, Luana. Adrian, a 2020 article published by Brookings titled "The Challenges for Black Men and the Case for Action" talks about the notion that to be male, poor, and either Black American or Native American is to confront on a daily basis a deeply held racism that exists in every social institution. The author goes on to talk about the need for a new deal for Black men, a new deal, which would consist of intentional policy making in the fields of education, training, the labor market, and tackling concentrated poverty. Adrian, your work in this market has had many touch points, both on the inside and the outside among those populations. How has this idea of a new deal informed your leadership strategies?
Can you do me a favor real quick?
Yes.
At the end of the question you gave Mr.
Yes.
Blunt, what was go back to that?
Sure. So the new deal that the author...
No, the question that you read, Mr. Blunt, the end of his question.
The end of Mr. Blunt's question.
His second question.
Okay.
Black press, I revised, basically.
Yes, thank you. Okay. I want to touch that because that has a lot to do with our lived experience, and I'm going to tie that in. But I want to start off about the New Deal.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a story. A couple years ago, President 45 created tax reform where he said that not all of America had experienced the economic boom under President Obama's era, and he said rural America and inner city America have been left out. So he asks economic development agencies and municipalities across the country to put together these proposals submitted to the feds to redistribute money and invest in projects that will uplift rural and inner city communities. So I was at the Chamber of Commerce at the time under Bob Duffy, and he was like, Adrian, we're gonna go for this. We didn't know everybody else in the community was going for it too, the city, GRE, everybody was, right? But he said, Adrian, so put together like some data around like life expectancy, health stuff, you know, put it together, and then we're gonna submit this. So little Adrian is sitting at his computer, just typing away, looking up data by census tract and zip codes around poverty, life expectancy, STD rates, academic achievement, college completion, home ownership, income, you name it. I'm looking up all of this data. And do you all know which demographic was constantly coming in last? Anybody want to guess?
Black males?
Black men. Last time I checked, I was a black man. So I'm sitting at my computer, I'm seeing this constantly, and it starts to have an emotional effect on me. Like I'm like short of breath, I'm like sweating, I'm almost gonna cry. Like it just was overwhelming me because for so long, you know, in our community, it's been like black women are the most vulnerable, black women endure all these hardships, black women, black women, black women. Now I'm looking at the numbers in our community, and it's a different narrative. And the first thought that crossed my mind was, what does it mean to hate a man? What does it mean to hate a man? I had to go look it up. Does anyone know what that word is? Misandry. Misandronism is the hatred of men. And in that moment, simultaneously, as I'm Googling what does it mean to hate a man, I'm realizing that black men are not the authors of their own narrative, because every black man should know that word, and we don't. And then it became apparent to me that in many ways, our reality has been shaped by outside communities that project a dynamic that is not really true. The 6th leading cause of death in this country for black men is police violence. Black men have the least life expectancy. I mean, I could just go on and on and on, but I wanted to go back to the question you asked Mr. Blunt about bias in black media. And this is what broader America has to understand. We are born of an experience and a legacy in this country. And to divorce us from that, to expect us to talk the way you talk, act the way you act, think the way you think, desire the same things you desire, agree with policies that you propose, or to perceive fairness the way you conceptualize fairness, is almost like eliminating the heritage, the legacy, and the history our people have had in this country. To ostracize Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee is only to say that there is no acceptable means of protest to people who are not interested in your interpretation of where we all live, a country we all call home. But you want to know the truth? The people who know the real America are people in 14605, people in 14621, people who walk thousands of miles in deserts to be met by a gun and told to go back. People who risk their life to cross the ocean and told they have to go back. People who have strived for generations. It wasn't until I got to Yale and was taught African American history by Jonathan Holloway, who is today the president of Rutgers University. He's a mentor of mine. That I understood black people have been fighting for equity of opportunity and the right of self-determination. We are what we conceive ourselves to be, not what you want me to be. Since slave ships, but we only are taught the civil rights movement, which in many ways, if you look at the spectrum of transformation, is on the conservative end of the black liberation timeline. You want to know what America's really like? Listen to the voices of those who right now find their identities outside of the mass conception of what it means to be an American. Some of us constantly talk about like the founding fathers, but I talk about a group that I call the reframers. People who have understood the idea of America better than the men in Philadelphia in 1774. And have done everything in their power to force this country to actually be what was written on paper. We're lucky enough as a community to have a matriarch and patriarch who are responsible for, between the two of them, 4 amendments to the Constitution. 4 great steps toward actually meeting in practice what was declared on paper. But we can't rest on them. There's a lot more work that has to be done today. And when you talk about a new deal for black men, guess where the answers come? From black men. You can't impose a will on folks and not know what they really need. I think at the root and core of America is the idea that people can be whatever they desire to be as long as it does no harm to anyone else. And so if we're serious, or if there's a genuine will to make this country better, we have to listen to the many Americas, right? E pluribus unum, from many one. So a little bit different than what Obama said in his 2004 DNC speech, right? There's not a black American. No, there is. There are many Americas. And when we learn to appreciate and respect and celebrate them all like a salad and what they all bring to the nature and character of this country, then we will know America. But if we continue to try to force people into conformity and assimilation and ask them to walk out of their identity to be something else, that's not America. In fact, that's where many people across the world have fled to come to. So.
Adrian, thank you. Wow.
Can I ask a follow-on question, though, for Adrian?
Sure.
So what do you think our role or your role as a black man is in changing the narrative that you just described?
My role since I was 12 years old has been to meet the needs of those in need and do whatever I can today until I can do more tomorrow. So if you notice at the Chamber of Commerce, I got there was no workforce development effort, there was no educational initiatives efforts, there was no talent strategy. And so now that office, it exists with people doing this work now. I mean, I've left, but now I've gone on to Foundry, which is a future-focused industry. And not only are we employing young kids from the same zip codes that we grew up in at a gainfully employing wage with driver's education, licenses, buying them cars, giving them literacy and numeracy remediation. We're in the city schools giving kids math remediation from 4th grade and 8th grade and creating a curriculum in partnership with the district that will give kids access to learning about technologies that will redefine the future. We all have a part to do, right? Like we all have a role to play. But if I'm being completely honest, there's 2 that might seem very simple, but I think are very important. And the first one is you really only change one life at a time. One life at a time. And I joke because at the Chamber, I had to have this 30,000-foot regional approach. But now that, guess what? My Rochester is 9 people, 9 lives. right? Like not all of them are in my apprenticeship. Some of them are managers, but I hire folks from where I came from, and I know that I'm pouring into you. And we can talk more about poverty because poverty and poor is different. Poverty is in my opinion, a state of the human condition. Poor is just lack of access and choices. Where for some people, you put them around opportunity and they're gonna thrive. For other folks, that's not enough. So there's that piece. But then the other piece is you really, so I like to say, so Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But I would add to that, what are you willing to become for your country? You all, America has to rest in our hearts and in our minds. And the moment we treat somebody a certain way, we act a certain way, we ignore somebody, we cut them off, it's not America anymore. And it's hard because, where we're from, we've had an experience that it is difficult not to be angry. It is very difficult to know that you're existing at a time when the life you're living is unfair, and it's unfair just because of who you are. But we all have to be willing to really do the work. And you know this as well, Miriam, as a DE&I practitioner. We are challenged with confronting people where they are, educating, informing, and enlightening them, and trying to motivate them to be something better. Because ultimately, the quality of our workplace, our community, our neighborhood is the sum of the interactions between one another. And if the majority of those interactions are negative, so go ask somebody in 14621 how they feel about living in Rochester. And then ask somebody in Brighton how do they feel about living in Rochester. And you're gonna get two totally different experiences. And they're gonna look different too. That's up to us to change.
It is. Adrian, I want you to drink some water, if you will, because I'm going to round your questions out, okay? And we'll come back this way. Promoting perpetuity is a leg of tonight's theme. Perpetuity is synonymous with the term endless. Forbes magazine published an article in 2020 titled, "Dear Black Professionals, 6 pieces of advice a white manager may not give you." This article was published in an effort, there's an assumption on my end here, to serve as a bit of a tool for Black professionals. I'm going to name the 6 points, Adrian, and ask you quickly to respond to each. So just a quick sort of top of the mind, all right? Okay. Hear what they say, but mostly watch what they do. So this speaks to the double speech that is prevalent in the professional realm.
That's right.
Let's go.
That's right. You want me to speak to that?
That point, we'll
Yep.
go right down the line.
So I would just say that it is going to be easy to always be tempted to say you believe one thing and negate that by your actual actions. And I'll just give you a most famous example, right? Like it could be, we need to have a more diverse work environment, and there could be a promotion, and somebody could identify like we need more people of color in leadership. And then let's say you want to go for that role, rather than resign or say, you know what, Miriam would be great for that role, you'll step up as well. So then you have to ask yourself, like, what am I willing to pay? This goes back to my other comments about who are you willing to be for this to exist? But what are you willing to do in order to really see wrongs to be righted? And it's not enough to just say the right thing if you're not really willing to embody those values in your behavior.
All right. Don't automatically assume that Black executives will bend over backwards to support you.
So back to my earlier comments, right? Like there's a lot of us who have inhaled the fumes of what broader society says we should be. So there are people who are Black, but don't hold and heart and mind a genuine commitment to confronting anti-black racism, which we have to be specific about. There's many forms of hate, but anti-black racism in this country seems to be the most pervasive and long-running form of hatred, and it's one that, as a broader society, we've grown a tolerance for. And so we have to remember there's a lot of folks who are black, right, who potentially could feel like the only solution to being a victim of anti-black racism is, and I think folks can confuse the two, right? There's a difference between striving for inclusion into whiteness and fighting anti-black racism. So when you talk about black leaders not bending over backwards for you, being included into whiteness is a very different aspiration than making sure people respect you for being who you are.
That's right. Very good. Okay, number 3, Adrian. Just because others can get away with it doesn't mean you can.
Obviously, there's a different standard for people of color, right? And I think there's also that what goes along with that is a sense of we have to be exceptional, just already. And it's funny because I was just in a conversation yesterday, because I don't know if you all know this, but at the Supreme Court right now, affirmative action is on the chopping block, but not through a black case, actually through Asians taking PWIs, but very elite Ivy League institutions to court because they're being denied admission even though they beyond meet the standard for admission, which just goes to say, like, the fact that this is an issue is implying that the way whiteness is set up, right, is to allow certain people, othered people, in if you meet a certain criteria, but you're never to become the majority, right? Like, even as a whole, if you achieve, so the trope of Asians being the model minority, super smart, overachieving as though like achieving isn't enough, but people say they overachieve, right? It is an example that, number one, they're criticized for now being overachievers. Number two, because their admission into some of these campuses threaten the demographics in the population of these campuses. So they, in some ways, will be the majority in some places where people clearly now don't want them to be the racial majority, which is implying that this standard was to allow some of you, but never all of you. And so when you say, this might be okay for some, but not for all, right? That works in many ways. But even in the idea for folks who believe like black people's plight is as a result of their actions. Well, now you have a group of people that have literally done everything and then some, and still they're being excluded. And our community knows for a long time, right? Like we watched this movie 300 years ago, right? Like, so now other communities are learning this lesson. And it's, leading to the same grief, disappointment, shock, that there is a hate problem in this country.
How about find your peeps?
Oh. So the way I made it through Yale was finding my tribe, right? And when you're at a school like Yale or Harvard, right, like, especially us, but like everybody is in many ways, because you are around a level of privilege and wealth. It blew my mind to people. Like when I first got there, the youngest Kennedy was like just graduating. And then you had the heirs of the Mars fortune, the heirs of Goodyear. You had I could go on and on about the folks who were there. So everybody is challenged and confronted with this, like, are you gonna reinvent yourself, or are you gonna stay true to who you are? Or are you gonna stay true to who you are and like know why you're here? And when I found like my group of people, they helped me feel comfortable in a place and in spaces that were like, might as well have been another planet. And I'll just add this in. Like when I first got there, anybody ever been to New Haven, Connecticut? Okay. So you know Yale is right downtown. And then there's Elm Street. And across Elm Street were the New Haven Green and the Real World. When I first got there, I would have to walk across the street and just go sit on the New Haven Green to be around regular people and feel a sense of normalcy. People catching the bus, people going to work, people yelling, screaming, people riding bikes, like just to feel, because campus was another planet. Mm-hmm. But then I found my tribe and I didn't have to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Could I make a comment? You talked about Harvard, and it's a good school, don't get me wrong. I had a classmate when I was in undergrad school many, many years ago, a guy by the name of Reginald Lewis. He was one of the first people, in fact, there's a statue of him at Harvard now. He had a LBO. He bought all of the international business of Beatrice Food, international global company, and he decided we need to, can't manage stuff in Indonesia, Singapore, Chile, Malaysia, Latin America, South America. So he decided to sell all of that off, pay down debt, and consolidate in Western Europe, which was in Paris, France. And he borrowed $400 million from Bankers Trust, that's a merchant bank, and the rest from Drexel Burnham Lambier, and ran the company and was very, very successful. Well, I was in class with him for one solid year. We studied economics. You know, my little town, I can remember when we didn't even have a red light or caution light. So to study complex economic theories, fiscal policy, monetary policy, supply side economics, push-pull demand, it was amazing. But what I'm saying is, don't get wrapped up because it's Harvard. You still got to learn some basic mathematics, some calculus. Calculus is calculus if you go to the U of R, St. John's Fisher, Brockport. That's not going to change, okay? I had a professor from North Carolina, I'll never forget, chemistry professor, a guy named Joe Trotter. He was good. He was in North Carolina, segregated hospital, and the doctors came in and looked at him, and he said, I'll fix this. He started reading them chemical books on organic chemistry. They wanted to know, who are you? Why are you studying organic chemistry? So knowledge is knowledge. And I don't know of no one who has a monopoly on knowledge or have a monopoly on stupidity, okay? That covers the spectrum. So we got to be very careful because, you know, the world is complex. We saw what happened January 6th, 2 years ago, all them anti-Semitic flags, anti-racial things. This country's gonna have to come to grips with something, and we've never done that. But if we're gonna live as a society and as a United States of America, we're gonna have to come to grips with that.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. Okay, so I'm gonna round out the list, and then LaWanna, we will conclude with your final question. So the number 6 point says that it's not just what you know and who you know, but also who knows you and what you're known for. Mm.
Do you want to maybe take that one, LaWanna? You want to take a stab at it?
What you're known for, not who you know?
That's right. Reputation, yes.
Reputation is important. I would not say that it is the be-all. My experience has been you have to produce, you have to have results, and not just knowing somebody. I mean, it does help to have connections, it does help to have mentors, but you've got to be able to produce. You've got to be able to be, and I hate to say exceptional, but you do have to be able to show that you know what you're doing in order to be elevated into certain spaces. The idea that, oh, we need to integrate, I don't know, a corporate board or a leadership team, and we're just going to pick someone and put it on because they're a person of color. I don't agree with that. I think that if the goal is to have, a diverse organization or a diverse board that's high functioning, you got to pick the right folks that actually know what they're doing. So I don't necessarily believe in it's just who you know. I think you have to know something. And you have to show up. Mm-hmm. You have to show up prepared.
Mm-hmm. Luana, in the past 5 years, the
you
term.
Didn't want me to?
Oh,
I think Adrian wants to chime in.
Please.
I just want to make sure we giving our beautiful queen here as much time to talk as me and Mr. Blunt, because y'all know we can talk.
Appreciate it.
So I think it's important to know a couple things, right? Because something that I think a lot of folks in this room know, especially because there's so many change agents in this room, is it's a fine line between being seen as movement forward and being seen as somebody who threatens the status quo. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to rattle chains, it's okay to agitate as long as you do it within certain ways. But it feels like when people know you represent genuine change, your presence, your voice, the way you think, and the effect that you have on folks, right? It can lead to you being marginalized. It can be something as simple as not getting an invitation to a panel if people don't want to hear certain truths. It could be not getting a certain job because people know if you get that job, you're gonna really do the kind of diagnostics that's gonna lead to policy proposals that will really shake things up and change things. It can be to not putting you in a position of influence because people listen to you and they will follow you and they will hear you, and folks don't want that either. And there's a lot of change agents in this room, and I know we all know that it's a fine line between having a reputation that people take serious and they respect, but there's always a but. And the goalpost always moves for you when they know what you represent and what you mean. And I think being a man of faith, I do not believe I could be where I am and have the story that I have if it wasn't for like God's providence and his purpose, right? Like I think I could have easily been suffocated by the circumstances and situations that life bore me into. But I always say I'm proud to be my mother and father's son because I'm very proud to be their son, and things haven't been perfect, but if I didn't have them, I wouldn't be who I am today. We as infiltrative leaders have to gain the wisdom to know what to do and when, because timing is everything, right? Like we have to get strategic, and I'll just end here because I think I'm on a panel with a sailor and I'm a U.S. Marine. And in many ways, you all, like, we have to get military precise and strategic about what does it really take to get us from here to where we want to go. And I mean, I could dissect that, but I'll just leave us there because it's gonna take that level of thought, that level of wisdom, that level of planning to really, it can't just be about the cult of personality. And, and I want to just end here, y'all. I'm so sorry. Once I start, it's so hard to stop, but I want to just end here. A couple months ago, you all remember when Republicans took the House back. They were electing a speaker, and they put Kevin McCarthy on the merry-go-round 15 times, right? I'll be honest, I was at work. I had my laptop up, and that was the first time I felt like Congress was really working. Everybody was there. Everybody was in a seat. There was debates. There was energy. And you knew where folks stood on issues. And even though I don't agree with like what the Republicans who were like holding out, I didn't agree with like what they want, clearly. but I respected what they were willing to do to get it. And it made me think about people on the side that I would find myself on. Isn't child poverty serious? Isn't racism serious? Isn't homelessness serious? Isn't the crisis at the border serious? Isn't the lack of social mobility and economic mobility serious? Isn't the fact that our dollar depreciates in value every day and gives poor people less purchasing power through inflation serious? I mean, I could go on and on and on and on and on, but why aren't those causes enough to see the same level of resolve? So when I say cult of personality, I see you on CNN, I see you on MSNBC, I see you always in the camera, I see you making tweets, but when will you do something like that and send these single moms, people wrongfully incarcerated by a criminal justice system that said they were born guilty, kids who graduate from high school and still can't read or do math, like my apprentices who walked in at 18, 19, 20 years old with a second and third grade proficiency level. Their diplomas aren't worth the paper they're written on. To the black man who can't go to school because he got a drug charge, can't get public housing, and is forced to go back out there and sell drugs because he really can't make it. To all these people, when are you going to send the real message, I am standing in the gap for you? I'm not making a tweet, because tweets, we're not going to tweet our way to freedom. We're not going to speech our way to freedom. And in this day and age, I would argue, Frederick Douglass and Dr. King would say, why are you marching when you got people on the town board? Why are you marching when you got mayors and majority school boards and city councils and state legislatures and presidents? They had to agitate because they could never achieve those roles. But now we have. And we got to also confront the reality to your previous question, Miriam. Mm-hmm. We getting them because you're not going to rock the boat sometimes. Mm-hmm. You getting it because you don't threaten the status quo sometimes. Mm-hmm. And you there to carry a message back. And as a community, that's an intra-community conversation we got to be clear about.
Intra.
Mm-hmm. We got to be real with ourselves before we can expect the world to take us serious. When one person stands up and somebody else leaves them hanging, or if you're not going to take that role under these terms, but you will, if there's always remember this, individual compliance is the biggest gear in the machine of racism. We're always gonna find people who are willing to consent to. Remember the Equal Rights Amendment? Y'all know I'm a baby, but I'm sure some of y'all remember the ERA, right? Who did they have out there saying that's a terrible idea? A woman. As long as you can find people in that oppressed subgroup willing for their personal gain to put the community at risk, the machine is going to continue to run.
But we have to be willing to put people in those positions who will stand up and be heard to risk themselves. We have folks on town boards. We've got a mayor at the city of Rochester, and we had another mayor also at the city of Rochester, who in some instances was vilified for her stance to try to help African American people. But it is important, even though you have these people in these roles, they have to be held accountable, and they have to be brave, and they have to be willing to put themselves out there on a limb to do what's best to move African American, Black, and brown people forward. We can't continue with this narrative, oh, we've got this person sitting on the board, when they're not even vocal for us.
Right.
And I've seen it so often that we put people in these positions and they're not held accountable, and we continue to vote them in year after year after year. We need to be looking at the results. What are you doing for Black and brown people? How are you advocating for them? How are you standing up for them? So I'll use myself as an example. At the United Way, I said I don't sit there with the status quo. The DEI strategy for the United Way was created by me. The assumption was they already had one. They didn't. I just wrote it a couple weeks ago. We can't continue the status quo. We have to, being African American, Black and brown people, we have to stand up when we are put in these positions of power. And you're right, Martin Luther King marched, right, because he had to do that, right? But now the world is a little different.
That's right.
We've got folks sitting in Congress.
That's right.
We got folks, we had Obama. I'm not an Obama fan because I'm a person who looks at results.
That's right.
Did he do all that he could?
That's right.
When he had a deck he had a hand that was stacked, and he didn't do all that he could.
That's right.
So we can have folks sit in those positions, but we do have to they have to be brave.
That's
Is all
right.
I'm trying to say. They have to be brave.
That's
Let
absolutely
me, it's very interesting to listen to my young brothers and sisters. See, I'm as close to 80 years old as you can get without being 80. So I've seen this circle before.
That's right.
But Adrian, there is a responsibility that parents have to take to raise their kids. How can you have a city school district with a budget of $958 million rather, almost $1 billion? That's more than I'm not talking about outside revenues. That's more than the city of Rochester and the county's budget in terms of what they charge property owners and fees, not what they get from city and state and federal combined. And we get the same old results. As they say, the absolute definition of stupidity is keep doing the same thing over and over and keep getting the same results. So, but getting back to parental responsibility, when I was growing up, we had apartheid in America, but there was no excuse for my mother. In fact, it was a black church, Hill Street Baptist Church, that we had an annex, and that's where we went to kindergarten. The government had nothing to do with that. That was some institutions, some people in the community that said our kids going to be ready for first grade, preschool, we call it preschool, pre-K now, kindergarten. My brother and I both went there at 3 and 5 years old. Now kids I thought everybody was ready for the first grade, knew basic colors and digits and how to count and 1, 2, 3. They aren't ready. Goes back to what he just said. So there is a parental responsibility. I grew up in a community, I think you mentioned Rosenwald. It was Sims Roebuck founder that gave away a lot of money, and basically he told the state of Virginia, I'm gonna make you abide by your own rules, separate but equal. At least we can have some schools. And he got black churches to donate the land, and they had 1-room, 3-room schools throughout the state of Virginia, the Rosenwald schools they call it. My mother went to one in 1919. My dad went to one in 1919. So I've seen these circles before. This is nothing new, okay? But there was a commitment for our parents to have these young people. You're going to learn how to read and write, and you're going to school, and you're going to learn just like everyone else. That's a parental responsibility. Government can't do everything for you. You are the government. You just don't know it, okay? It's just like that big-time executive from IT&T who didn't as International Telephone and Telegraph. They didn't own one telephone company in the continental United States. Sometimes the government governs best by governing least, but we can't have run around Robert Burns, going all over the country, going crazy too. So it's always a balance. And when you have that imbalance, there's going to be a correction, whether it's in the stock market, whether it's in the sociological sphere of people living, there's always going to be a correction.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. Okay, we're going to round this panel discussion out, this very lively panel discussion out, with the same question, which would have originally been Lawana's question. But I think that it's fitting to close the night out for each of you. The term Black resistance, the term Black exceptionalism, Black excellence? Does one begot the other?
Well, let me take a shot at that. We just played the Super Bowl, right? And you saw two black quarterbacks. Well, years ago, in the early 60s, there was a Greek handicapper. His name was Jimmy the Greek. He was on CBS with Brent Musburger and a guy named Herb Krause, who had just finished his professional career. I think he went to UCLA, high draft pick for Philadelphia Eagles, got traded back to Los Angeles. And he was on the television saying, oh, blacks don't have the necessary intellectual capacity to play quarterback, this and that. And Musburger said, Jimmy, I don't think you mean that. He dug himself deeper in the hole. I thought Herb Krause was going to body slam him right on the stage there. And I think Jane Kennedy was part of that too. She came here and did a big promotional thing for Kodak. In fact, we were on a plane one cold morning going back to New York City. She said, I've never seen it this cold in my life. It was about 10 below zero. But anyway, she was on my radio talk show. I'm a host. Now, I'm a panel on the show, Nate Brown and Truth, 1280 AM radio, if you want to listen to some good sports. But what I'm saying is, we have got to understand that, what do they say? Heads I win, tails you lose. That's what segregation was all about. Codified in the Constitution of the United States of America. And that had to be broken. That's what Brown versus Board of Education was all about, with Thurgood Marshall, Spotswood Robinson, Nimitz, president of Howard University. I mean, that was a legal case. And they had Dr. Kenneth Clark, who did the experiment with dolls and black kids, self-hatred. That's what you're talking about, is manifested self-hatred. So we got to get out of that mode, talk about it, and solve the problem. Here's another case. I was out at a reception one night, and a big-time Kodak executive was there. I'm not going to name any names. And a friend of mine had come to town to do some postdoctoral work on how to solve this medical problem called sickle cell anemia. Well, basically, we know what the problem is, haven't been able to solve it. You have sickle cells because there's a receptor on every blood cell that takes oxygen in. And for some reason, when that cell refuses to take oxygen, instead of looking like a T, it forms like a sickle. And he was doing some postdoctoral work, and this guy looked at him and says, a brilliant guy. In fact, he went on to become Surgeon General of the United States for a while. David Satcher was the name, right over at the medical school, over at the U of R. Spent about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 months over there doing some work. And he looked at him, he said, I don't understand. You're a black man, but you got white hair and a white beard. I think he got confused somewhere along the way. Now, how can you be a high-rising executive in a company that had a worldwide monopoly on the science of photographic imaging, when you have to sell that product to the world, and you think like that? That's why the company went down, with that kind of mindset. And it's tragic because you have some brilliant people in that research and development area over there, department, brilliant minds, but management wouldn't listen.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. Luana, Black resistance, Black exceptionalism, or Black excellence, does one precede the other?
Interesting question. Does one precede the other? Both are necessary. I can't say that one precedes the other. Black resistance is necessary in order to have change. Black exceptionalism is necessary to rise. So I can't necessarily say that one exceeds the other. That would be my opinion. Adrian?
Thank you, Luana. Thank you.
First of all, thank you to all the panelists, and to you all to hang in there with us. I would say that Black excellence is something that has to be conceived by the Black community. And I would say that it begins with resistance to what mainstream society tells a Black person they need to be. And you see in some places that fight can be something as trivial as like being able to come to work with a certain hairdo, to being able to express certain opinions, to even you talking about Ursula, being able to come in with a certain level of aggressiveness and forthrightness that in many ways would have ostracized, folks would be ostracized for. But the Wilsons and stuff, they already was looking for, certain things at Xerox anyway. So God bless them for that. But I would say resistance is the beginning, because I want to say this to, to majority folks, living in a society that lets you call each other niggas, promote images of violence and instability, and constantly promotes these tropes. Like if you look at even Black media, it's always slavery, civil rights, gangsta, hood, ghetto, but never showing that we are as diverse a community as any. And then I feel bad for, my Black suburbanites, my Black urban suburban students that I worked with at Pittsford and East Rochester, because those kids who don't know nothing about the hood go to school with kids who are trying to force that you gotta know every word in a rap song, you gotta know how to dress, you gotta know where to get drugs, you gotta know stuff. These kids, they not from 14605 or 14621. But because their only interactions with Blackness is through medium on TV, you assume this is what Black people are supposed to be doing. And whenever I watch like award ceremonies, and it is as of late, Black actors and actresses have been much more vocal about the kind of scripts that they write. And the only thing separating a white actress or actor and a Black one is opportunity. Is being cast in a role to show the diversity in our community like any other community. So just existing in that, for anybody that beats the odds that shouldn't exist, mind you, is resistance. And you know what Black excellence is? When your life lines up with your vision. Not the one the teacher told you had to have, not the one the coach told you have to have, not the one maybe your mom and dad told you had to have, not the one the TV and the music and the movies told you had to have, but the one you have for yourself. And I'll just say this, because I don't think a lot of people, so I grew up 14621, played football at Baden Street. So when you said Baden, you was right, Mr. Blunt. I played Pop Warner for Baden Street. But we had did so much in my first year, I didn't feel like there was nothing left. 2002, this 12-year-old Black boy who lived on Avenue D, 677, I saw short track speed skating in the Olympics. And I was like, wow. Watching these people skate fast and pretty much race track on ice. I wanted to do that. So I talked to my mom, talked to my uncle, paid for me to go out, and we had a team here because there was an Olympic gold medalist from Rochester named Kathy Turner, if people don't know. So I went out to the Rochester speed skating team that first day, and I did not know the first thing about ice skating. It was but I got so good. Preferred Care paid for me to go and train at the National Development Team in 2005 in Milwaukee at the West Allis Olympic Training Center. And had they not went through everything with MVP and stuff, I probably would have made the Olympic Games in 2006 in Torino, Italy. So it was funny, when I was in the Marine Corps in 2010, I was watching the 2010 games, in Vancouver watching like all the people I had came up with like at the Olympics, but I was in Afghanistan. But I said that to say, I think in like just that whole time in my life taught me how to be an individual. It taught me that I was gonna decide and define who I was gonna be and what I was gonna do. And that's Black excellence. When you have the right and you're enabled and equipped with everything it takes to bring your vision for yourself into reality and disregard all the other ones being imposed and projected on you. So it starts with resistance. And you know it's hard. Like, right, like, just like, and I love that you brought that up, Mr. Blunt, about the Allegheny Mountains, right? We overlook the treacherous path to freedom. And guess what? It's a treacherous path every day when I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose this relationship. I don't want to lose that promotion. Come on, y'all, these are the mountains. The deserts, the swamps. I don't want to get labeled a troublemaker. But you got to stay on your true north. That's the Black excellence.
Let me make one other statement also, and LaWanda, you would like this. There was a high-profile Jewish lawyer in town. His name was Emmanuel Goldman. Some of you people might remember him, but he was very involved in community activity. And when we had the second urban riot in the United States, it didn't happen in Dallas, Houston, Chicago, it happened right here in Rochester. He went to the United Way. It was a community chest. And a guy who was in charge there was a guy from Richard Miller, born and raised in South Carolina. You know, you're a product of your environment, so you knew how he thought. And they said, we need an urban league. And his associate, you talk about Black excellence, was a guy named William Jacob Knox. Dr. Knox was the second scientist to work in the research lab at Eastman Kodak. The first one was a guy named Jim Lavelle, who ran in the 1936 Olympiad in Berlin, Germany. He was on that 4x100 relay team, and they beat the Germans, and Adolf Hitler almost had a heart attack. Didn't even shake his hand. So that's Black excellence. But he came here, the housing situation was so bad, he left and went back to California, taught chemistry out there, UC Berkeley, UC Cal, somewhere out there. But Bill Knox was a unique guy because he got heavily involved in this community. He was on the board at Baden Street. He helped stabilize that area. And it was another gentleman who went through Baden Street, the late Trent Jackson. He ran in the 1964 Olympiads in Tokyo, Japan, when they looked at them Russian communists and beat them. And I guess Brezhnev could have been the chancellor there, the big chief. He almost had a heart attack because they wanted to be supreme in everything. And also, there's a synagogue right down the street from here, Temple Bresh Kodesh, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Every Martin Luther King birthday celebration, they would come to Mount Olivet Baptist Church. Then the following Friday, the Friday after, the people from Mount Olivet Baptist Church would attend the synagogue. So that was a community coming together, acknowledging each other, trying to solve problems so we will have a community. And that's leadership. And I think the rabbi was Rabbi Judah Miller, who was a forward-thinking guy. He understood what it took to survive as a country and as a people. And I want to say one other thing, and then I have to close this out. There was a rabbi from the Diamond District in New York City that came on a business that flew from New York to Chicago, but it must be a Jewish saint that's buried in a cemetery between, what's that, Dewey Avenue and Lake Avenue, almost up to Lake Ontario. And he wanted to see this cemetery where this Jewish saint was buried, and he had the plane rerouted, stopped in Rochester, met with some people. They found the site where that burial was, went up, went through his rites and rituals, and went back to New York. So all people who want to look forward have to know where there have been looking backwards so they know where they have to go when they have to look forward.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. All right, thank you. You know, giving reverence to our elders is a must in the Black community. So, Mr. Blunt, I wholeheartedly want to thank you for agreeing and lending so much knowledge to this panel discussion this evening. Thank you. Luana, as a fellow Black woman in this market who has made great strides, I've watched you because I know enough to keep my eyes on the key players, and I want to thank you for your commitment to this area, for your commitment to representing not only yourself but you know, the sisters who are coming after you and your peers as well. Thank you for being here tonight, Luana. And Adrian Hill, oh my goodness, what a force. Adrian, you know, you never cease to amaze me. And I tend to call on people who are tried and true, right? I am watching these people navigate in spaces, carefully navigate. Adrian, you are the future. You are. And, you know, I cannot thank you enough for lending yourself in the way that you have and continue to do in this area. So, Adrian, Luana, and Mr. Blunt, let's do this again and again. Thank you all for coming out tonight.
Let me make one more comment. He talked about the Marine Corps. I was part of the United States Navy in 1967 when there was a big conflict in the Middle East. In fact, we got a set of orders to run a blockade on the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus. That's that body of water that leads from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, because Russia only has one water port, that's on the Black Sea. But thanks to an Israeli gentleman by the name of Moshe Dayan, he had one eye. We used to call him one eye because he lost an eye in the War of Independence for 1948. But he was a master strategist and a master tactician in terms of the art of war. And they won and we prevailed, but we were standing by, believe me. And I said, this is going to be a big time collision. So I'm very familiar with the event and what can happen and what's happening in Israel today. Mm-hmm.